You might want to check that number again, the bank manager said, her voice smooth but edged with disbelief as the sound of paper tearing cut through the quiet marble lobby. Sharper than it should have been, louder than anyone expected, and for a moment, even the faint hum of the air conditioning seemed to pause as fragments of a $10 million check fluttered down onto the polished counter like they didn't belong to anyone important, like they were just scraps, just paper, just another mistake someone like him had no business making. And Marcus Reed didn't move, not at first, not when the last piece slid off the edge and landed near his worn leather shoes, not when a man in a navy suit a few feet away shifted uncomfortably and pretended to check his phone, not even when the young teller behind the desk lowered her eyes as if looking at him directly might confirm something she wasn't ready to admit. Because Marcus had been here before, not this exact bank, not this exact moment, but this feeling, this quiet assumption wrapped in politeness, this instant judgment that arrived before a single word could defend him. And he let the silence stretch just long enough to feel it settle into the room like a weight no one wanted to acknowledge, his fingers resting lightly against the edge of the counter, steady, deliberate, as if grounding himself in something real while everything else tried to define him into something smaller, something easier to dismiss and across. From him, Linda Carter straightened her posture, adjusting the cuff of her tailored blazer with the kind of precision that came from years of being certain she understood exactly who belonged in her bank and who didn't, her eyes scanning him once more from head to toe, taking in the faded denim jacket, the scuffed shoes, the quiet confidence she interpreted as misplaced calm. And there it was again, that subtle tightening at the corner of her mouth, the look that didn't need to say anything out loud because it had already said everything. And somewhere behind Marcus a soft murmur passed between two customers waiting in line, a whisper quickly swallowed but not quick enough to disappear, because moments like this had a way of pulling attention without asking for it. And Marcus finally inhaled, slow and controlled, his gaze dropping briefly to the torn pieces before lifting again, not angry, not pleading, just steady, as if he had already decided something long before he walked through those glass doors. Something about how far he would go and what he would not give away. And when he spoke, his voice was quiet, measured, almost gentle against the tension that had filled the space. I didn't ask you to believe it, he said, each word landing with a calm that didn't match the situation, didn't match what people expected from a man standing there with nothing but torn paper to prove his point. I asked you to run it. And the words didn't rise, didn't challenge, didn't demand, but they lingered in the air with a weight that made the young teller glance up for just a second, uncertain, as if something in that tone didn't fit the story everyone else had already written, and Linda let out a small breath that almost sounded like a laugh, though it never fully became one, her hand resting flat against the counter as if reclaiming control of the moment itself. Sir, she said, the word carrying none of the respect it usually held. We have procedures for situations like this. And somewhere in the distance a glass door opened, letting in a brief wash of sunlight that stretched across the marble floor and brushed against Marcus's shoulder, catching the edge of his profile in a way that made him look less like a disruption and more like something unmoved, something steady in a place built on appearances. And for a second, just a second, it felt like the room was waiting, not for him to leave, not for security, but for something else entirely, something no one there could quite name yet. The teller's fingers hovered above the keyboard, hesitating just long enough to betray the crack forming beneath the surface of routine, her eyes flicking from the torn pieces on the counter to the screen in front of her, then back to Marcus, as if searching for permission she had not been given, while Linda's posture tightened almost imperceptibly, the kind of subtle shift that came from someone who felt control slipping in a way she could not immediately explain. Emily, Linda said, her tone low but firm, the kind that carried across the counter without raising volume. There is nothing to run. And the words landed with practiced certainty, but Emily did not move, not right away, because something in Marcus's voice had stayed with her, not loud, not forceful, just steady, like it did not need to prove anything to be true. And Marcus remained still, his gaze no longer on Linda but on the faint reflection of the lobby lights stretching across the marble surface, as if the room itself had become part of the moment, each quiet detail pressing in around him, the soft shuffle of shoes behind him, the distant click of a pen, The muted whisper of someone stepping out of line to get a better look. All of it familiar in a way that did not make it easier, only clearer. Because he had spent years learning how rooms like this worked, how decisions were made before facts were checked, how assumptions filled the gaps where patience should have been, and he let the silence settle again, not as resistance, but as space, giving the moment exactly what it needed to reveal itself. "Please," he said after a second, his voice unchanged, "just verify the account." And there was no edge to it, no frustration, just a simple request that felt almost out of place against the tension building around it. And Emily swallowed, her hand finally lowering to the keyboard as Linda's eyes snapped toward her, sharp now, warning without needing words. But it was too late, because once doubt entered a system built on certainty, it did not leave quietly, and the first keystroke echoed louder than it should have, drawing the attention of a man near the back who paused mid-step, turning slightly as if he had heard something shift, something small but important, and Linda exhaled through her nose, a controlled breath that masked the flicker of irritation crossing her face. "You are making a mistake," she said, directing it at Emily but letting the words hang where Marcus could hear them, could feel them, could understand exactly where he stood in her eyes, and Marcus did understand. He understood it completely, because this was not about the check anymore. Not really. It was about a line that had been drawn long before he walked in, a line that said who was expected and who was not, who was trusted and who was questioned, and he had learned long ago that arguing with that line did not move it, but standing still in front of it sometimes did. And Emily's screen flickered as the system began to respond. Lines of data loading one after another, each second stretching just a little longer than it should have. The delay turning into its own kind of tension, and Linda shifted again, her hand tapping lightly against the counter, a rhythm that betrayed impatience she could no longer fully hide. "That account number is not valid," she said, more firmly now, as if saying it again would make it true. But Emily did not answer, her eyes narrowing slightly as she leaned closer to the screen, the glow reflecting faintly in her pupils. And then something changed, subtle at first, a pause in her breathing, a slight widening of her eyes, the kind of reaction that did not belong to confusion, but to realization. And Marcus saw it, not the details on the screen, not the numbers themselves, but the shift in her expression, the moment when doubt gave way to something else entirely. And he did not move, did not speak, because this part did not belong to him anymore. It belonged to the truth unfolding in front of them, piece by piece, independent of how anyone in the room felt about it. And behind him the murmurs grew a fraction louder, curiosity replacing certainty as people began to sense that something was not aligning the way it was supposed to, that the story they had quietly accepted a minute ago might not hold. And Linda noticed it too. The change in the air, the way attention had turned, the way control had started to slip not through confrontation but through quiet contradiction. And for the first time her gaze returned to Marcus with something new. Beneath the surface, not respect, not yet, but uncertainty, sharp and unwelcome, as if the room itself had begun to question her version of it. And Marcus simply stood there, steady as before, his hand resting lightly against the counter, waiting, not for approval, not for apology, but for the system to say what it had always known. Emily's hand froze above the keyboard for a fraction of a second longer, as if her body needed time to catch up with what her eyes were already beginning to understand. The numbers on the screen no longer behaving like a mistake, no longer aligning with the quiet dismissal that had filled the room moments ago. And she leaned in just slightly, her brow tightening, her lips parting without forming words, because what she was seeing did not match what she had been told to expect. And the system did not hesitate. It did not second-guess. It simply displayed what was there, line after line, account details unfolding with a clarity that left no room for interpretation. And behind her Linda shifted again, the controlled rhythm in her movements beginning to falter as the silence stretched into something heavier, something harder to manage. "Emily," she said, this time with a sharper edge, a note of impatience that cut through the air. "I said there is nothing to verify." But the words landed differently now, not with authority, but with a kind of urgency that had not been there before. And Emily swallowed, her fingers finally moving again, not to cancel, not to step back, but to confirm, to run the process all the way through as requested, and the soft clicking of the keys echoed in the space like a quiet refusal to look away, and Marcus remained exactly where he was, his posture unchanged, his expression steady. But there was something deeper in his eyes now, not satisfaction, not even relief, just a quiet recognition of a moment he had lived through too many times before, the moment when doubt began to turn, when perception started to crack, and truth moved forward whether anyone was ready for it or not. And the screen refreshed, the final confirmation appearing in a clean, undeniable line, the balance clear, the account active, the amount real, and Emily's breath caught just slightly. Enough for the man behind Marcus to notice, enough for the whisper behind them to stop completely, because silence had shifted from assumption to attention, and Linda saw it. She saw the change in Emily's face, the way her shoulders tensed, the way her eyes did not move away from the screen, and for the first time a flicker of something unfamiliar crossed Linda's expression, not doubt in the system, but doubt in herself, sharp and unwelcome. "What is it?" she asked, her voice lower now, controlled but no longer certain, and Emily hesitated, her gaze finally lifting from the screen to meet Linda's, and there it was, that moment, fragile and irreversible. "The account is valid," she said quietly, each word careful, measured, as if speaking too loudly might somehow undo what had already been confirmed, and the air in the lobby seemed to thin, the quiet stretching wider, deeper, as if the room itself had taken a step back to absorb what had just been said, and Linda did not respond immediately, her hand still resting against the counter, fingers slightly curled, her mind moving faster than her expression could follow, recalculating, reordering, trying to fit this new information into a framework that had already rejected it. And Marcus did not look at her, not yet, his gaze still forward, still calm, as if the confirmation was not a victory, but simply a fact returning to its place, and a soft sound came from somewhere behind, a shift, a breath, a subtle acknowledgement that something had changed, that the man standing at the counter was no longer what they had assumed him to be, and Linda straightened, her posture tightening again. But this time it was different, less about control, more about recovery, about finding footing where the ground had just shifted beneath her. "There must be an error in the system," she said, the words coming out faster now, less measured, as if speed might restore certainty, but Emily did not move, did not type, did not correct, because there was nothing to correct, and the screen remained unchanged, steady, indifferent to the tension it had created, and Marcus finally turned his head slightly. Not fully, just enough to acknowledge her without confronting her, his voice calm as before, almost quiet against the weight of the moment. "There is no error," he said, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than any argument could have, because it was not defensive, it was not reactive, it was simply true, and Linda felt it, not in the words themselves, but in the stillness behind them, the kind of stillness that did not need to prove anything. And for the first time since he had walked in, she did not have an immediate response, her certainty slipping just enough to reveal the space where something else might enter, something she had not expected to face, and the room waited again. But this time it was not waiting for him to explain himself, it was waiting for her to understand what she had already done. The words settled into the space between them, not loud, not forceful, but immovable, and for a moment no one spoke, not Emily, not the customers behind Marcus, not even Linda, whose posture remained upright, but no longer carried the same effortless certainty it had only minutes before, because something had shifted in a way that could not be undone, and the system screen remained steady, unchanging. A quiet witness that did not argue, did not defend, did not explain, it simply existed, and that was enough, and Linda's eyes flicked toward it again, faster this time, as if she could catch it in a mistake if she looked quickly enough. But the numbers did not change, the account did not disappear, the balance did not adjust itself to fit her expectations, and she exhaled slowly, a controlled breath that did not quite hide the tension now rising beneath the surface. "Even if the account is active," she began, her voice carefully measured again, reaching for authority like a familiar tool, "there are procedures, verification steps, identity confirmation." And her gaze returned to Marcus, sharper now, searching, testing, as if the problem had simply moved from the system to him. We cannot process something of this size without proper documentation. And the statement sounded reasonable, almost routine, but the timing of it shifted its meaning, turning it into something else, something closer to defense than protocol, and Marcus listened without interrupting, his expression unchanged, his presence steady in a way that made the words feel like they were moving around him rather than through him. And he nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. Of course, he said quietly, his hand moving slowly to the inside pocket of his jacket, the motion deliberate, unhurried, drawing just enough attention to make the room lean in again, not physically, but in focus, in awareness. And he placed a slim leather wallet on the counter, opening it with care, revealing a set of identification cards arranged neatly, not worn, not flashy, just precise. And he slid one forward, stopping it just short of Linda's hand, not pushing it toward her, not forcing her to take it, simply placing it there as an option, as a fact waiting to be recognized. And Linda hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, before reaching for it, her fingers tightening slightly as she lifted the card, her eyes scanning it quickly at first, then again, slower, more carefully, because something about it did not match the version of the situation she had constructed. The name, the credentials, the quiet authority embedded in details she could not dismiss as easily as appearance, and the silence around them deepened, the kind that did not come from absence of sound, but from presence of attention, every small movement amplified, every breath noticed, and Emily glanced between them, her uncertainty replaced now with something closer to clarity, her posture shifting subtly, as if she were no longer waiting for instruction, but observing something unfold beyond her. Control, and Linda lowered the card slightly, her lips pressing together as her mind worked through what she was seeing, aligning it with the account, with the numbers, with the man standing in front of her, and the gap between those pieces narrowed in a way that left very little room for doubt. And yet she did not immediately respond, because responding meant acknowledging, and acknowledging meant more than just correcting a transaction. It meant facing the moment that had already happened, the assumption that had already been made. And Marcus watched her, not with expectation, not with impatience, but with a calm that carried its own weight, as if he had already accepted whatever came next. And that acceptance made it harder, not easier, because it removed the possibility of resistance, leaving only truth in its place. And behind him someone shifted again, the faint sound of a shoe against marble breaking the stillness just enough to remind the room that time had not stopped, that this moment existed within a larger world that would move on. But for now, everything remained focused here, at the counter, between two people standing on opposite sides of something that had just begun to collapse. And Linda finally looked up, meeting Marcus's gaze fully for the first time. And there was something different there now, not yet respect, not quite understanding, but no longer dismissal. And her voice, when it came, was quieter, less certain. "Mr. Reed," she said, the name landing carefully, as if testing its place in the space between them. "I will need to escalate this." And the words were procedural, expected even, but beneath them was a shift she could not fully hide. A recognition that this was no longer a simple situation she could control alone. And Marcus gave a small nod, not approval, not permission, just acknowledgement. "Do what you need to do," he replied, his tone unchanged, steady as ever, and the simplicity of it left no room for argument, no room for delay, only action. And Linda turned slightly, signaling toward the office behind her, her movement more restrained now, more deliberate, as if each step carried the weight of what had already happened. And as she reached for the phone on the desk, the room seemed to hold its breath once more, not in anticipation of conflict, but in quiet expectation of something else, something just beyond the edge of what they could see, something that was about to enter and redefine everything that had come before. The soft click of the phone receiver settling back into place echoed more loudly than it should have, as if the room had grown quieter just to hear it. And Linda's hand lingered there for a second, her fingers resting against the edge of the desk as though she needed that point of contact to steady herself before turning back, her expression carefully reconstructed but no longer seamless, the confidence still present but now layered with something else, something tighter, more controlled. And when she faced the counter again, her movements were slower, more deliberate, each step measured as if the space between her and Marcus had changed in a way she could not fully define. "He is on his way," she said, her voice composed but softer than before, lacking the earlier sharpness, and the words carried across the marble floor, reaching the ears of those who had quietly remained, not out of obligation, but because something in the moment had held them there. Curiosity no longer casual but focused, and Marcus gave a slight nod, acknowledging the update without reaction, his posture unchanged, his hand resting near the edge of the counter as if time itself had slowed around him, and the seconds that followed stretched in a way that made every small detail stand out. The faint hum of the overhead lights, the distant sound of a door opening somewhere deeper in the building, the subtle shift of weight from one foot to another among the waiting customers, all of it weaving into a quiet tension that did not need raised voices to exist. And Emily glanced again at the screen, as if expecting it to change, to correct itself, to return to something simpler, but it did not. It remained exactly as it was, steady and undeniable, and she looked back at Marcus, this time not with hesitation, but with a kind of cautious respect forming in her eyes, the kind that grew not from appearance, but from evidence. And Linda noticed that too, the shift not just in the room but in the people within it. The way attention had subtly moved away from her control and towards something she could not redirect, and she drew in a slow breath, her shoulders straightening once more as she prepared to reclaim what she could. "For records," she said, her tone now formal, procedural, reaching for structure where certainty had faltered. "We will need to document the transaction thoroughly." And Marcus inclined his head slightly, not agreeing, not resisting, simply allowing the process to unfold, and the quiet between them returned. But it was different now, not empty, not dismissive, but full, layered with everything that had already happened, everything that could not be undone. And then it came, the sound of approaching footsteps, firm but unhurried, echoing faintly against the polished floor from the corridor beyond the office doors, a rhythm that carried presence without needing urgency. And the room responded to it instinctively, subtle shifts in posture, a glance toward the source, a collective awareness that something was about to change again. And Linda turned slightly, her gaze moving toward the hallway, her expression tightening just enough to reveal anticipation mixed with something closer to concern, because this was no longer a situation she could resolve quietly, no longer something that would pass unnoticed. And the footsteps grew closer, steady, measured, each one marking the approach of someone who did not rush because he did not need to. And Marcus remained still, his eyes forward, his breathing even, as if he had already accepted whatever came next, not as a challenge, but as a continuation of something larger than the moment itself. And the door at the end of the corridor opened with a soft, controlled motion, letting in a wash of brighter light that stretched across the floor and reached the edge of the counter. And for a brief second, everything seemed to pause again, not in confusion this time, but in expectation, the kind that settles just before something shifts completely. And Linda's hand tightened slightly at her side as she stepped back, half a pace, creating space without fully realizing it. And the figure moved into view, composed, deliberate, his presence carrying a quiet authority that did not need to announce itself. And the air in the room changed once more, not abruptly, not dramatically, but enough for everyone to feel it, the kind of change that signaled the end of one version of a story and the beginning of another. And Marcus did not turn immediately, not until the footsteps reached the counter, not until the presence was close enough to be felt without being seen. And then, slowly, he shifted his gaze, not hurried, not reactive, just in time to meet what had finally arrived, as the room held its breath, waiting for a single word that would decide everything. The man did not raise his voice, did not rush, did not announce himself. And yet the moment he stepped fully into the light, the entire room seemed to recognize that something had shifted beyond correction, his presence carrying a quiet authority that did not rely on volume or display, but on something steadier, something built over time. And his polished shoes moved across the marble floor with a soft, deliberate rhythm until he reached the counter, stopping just beside Linda without looking at her first, his attention settling forward, focused, and for a brief second no one spoke, not even Linda, whose posture had straightened instinctively, Her shoulders pulled back as if preparing for scrutiny she could not yet define, and Marcus met the man's gaze calmly, without hesitation, without surprise, as if this moment had always been part of the path that brought him here. And the silence stretched just long enough to feel intentional, not awkward, not uncertain, but measured, like a pause before something precise. And then the man's expression softened in a way that was almost imperceptible but carried weight, his chin dipping slightly in acknowledgement before he spoke, his voice low, controlled, and unmistakably respectful. "Sir," he said, the word landing gently but firmly in the center of the space between them, and the effect was immediate, not loud, not explosive, but absolute. As if the entire room had shifted its understanding in a single breath, the quiet whispers that had lingered before disappearing completely, replaced by a stillness that felt heavier, more aware, and Linda's fingers tightened at her side, her composure faltering just enough to reveal the impact of what she had just heard. Because the word did not belong to the version of the situation she had constructed, it did not align with the assumptions she had made, and yet it had been spoken with certainty, without hesitation, without doubt, and that made it undeniable, and Marcus gave a small nod in return, not exaggerated, not performative, just a simple acknowledgement of recognition, and for the first time there was something in his expression that shifted. Not pride, not vindication, but a quiet release, as if a weight he had not chosen had finally been set down, and the man beside Linda turned slightly now, his gaze moving to her, not sharp, not aggressive, but direct, and the absence of emotion in his expression made it more difficult to meet. "Is there an issue here?" he asked, his tone even, professional, but carrying an undercurrent that did not need to be stated to be understood, and Linda opened her mouth to respond, then paused, her thoughts colliding with the reality unfolding in front of her, the pieces refusing to fit the way they had before, and she glanced briefly at Marcus, then back at the man, searching for a way to bridge the gap between what she had done and what was now clearly true. "I was verifying the transaction," she said finally, her voice measured but thinner than before, lacking the earlier certainty that had guided her actions. And the man listened without interrupting, his eyes steady, taking in not just her words but the moment itself, the tension, the silence, the subtle shifts in the room. And then he nodded once, slowly, as if confirming something internally rather than reacting outwardly, and he turned back toward Marcus, his posture adjusting slightly, not in deference alone but in recognition. "Mr. Reed," he said, his tone respectful, consistent, "I apologize for the delay." And the word apology settled into the space with a weight that extended beyond procedure, beyond timing, touching something deeper that no one in the room could ignore. And Marcus held his gaze for a moment, his expression calm, thoughtful, as if measuring not the words themselves but the meaning behind them. And he nodded again, once, acknowledging it without amplifying it, without demanding more, and the quiet that followed was different now, no longer tense, no longer uncertain, but reflective, as if the room itself had taken a step back to absorb what had just happened, the shift from assumption to recognition unfolding in real time. And Linda stood there, still, her earlier certainty replaced by something far less comfortable, something that did not resolve quickly, because the moment could not be undone. The paper could not be restored, the assumption could not be erased, and yet everything around her had changed, and she could feel it in the way the room no longer looked at Marcus the same way, in the way even silence now carried a different meaning, one that she could not control, and Marcus remained where he was, steady, composed, his presence unchanged, but the space around him had shifted completely, revealing not who he had become in that moment, but who he had been all along. The apology did not echo, it settled, quiet and complete, and for a moment no one moved, as if the room itself needed time to adjust to the new shape of reality that had just formed in front of them. And the man who had spoken stepped slightly to the side, creating space not just physically but symbolically, shifting the center of attention away from authority and toward truth. And Marcus remained still, his hand resting lightly against the counter, his breathing even, his presence unchanged, despite everything that had just unfolded around him. And there was something almost unspoken in the way he stood there, not claiming the moment, not holding on to it, just allowing it to exist, and Linda felt it, felt the weight of that stillness more than anything else that had been said, because it left her with nothing to push against, nothing to correct, nothing to defend in the way she had been trained to do. And her gaze dropped briefly to the torn pieces of the check still scattered across the counter, the edges uneven, the ink lines broken, and in that small detail the entire situation condensed into something tangible, something she could not explain away with procedure or policy, and her throat tightened slightly as she looked back up, her composure still present but no longer effortless, no longer certain. "I did not realize," she began, the words coming slower now, less controlled, as if each one had to pass through something before it could be spoken, and she paused, searching for the right continuation. But there was no simple way to complete that sentence without acknowledging what it truly meant, and Marcus watched her, not with expectation, not with judgment, just with a quiet attentiveness that made the moment feel more honest than she was prepared for, and the man beside her remained silent, his presence steady, allowing the space to belong to her response rather than stepping in to resolve it. And that silence made it heavier, not lighter, because it removed the possibility of deflection, leaving only the truth of what had already happened, and Linda exhaled slowly, her shoulders lowering just a fraction as she let go of the structure she had been holding onto. "I made an assumption," she said finally, her voice quieter now, the words landing without defense, without excuse, and the admission hung in the air differently than anything before it, not as a correction but as a realization, something that could not be undone but could be understood, and Marcus held her gaze for a moment, considering, not the mistake itself but the way it was being acknowledged, and he nodded once, not in acceptance, not in dismissal, just in recognition that she had reached that point on her own, and behind them the room remained still, no whispers now, no shifting attention, just a quiet awareness that something important had happened, something that went beyond a transaction, beyond a single interaction, and Linda glanced again at the torn check, then back at Marcus, her hands now resting flat against the counter, no longer tapping, no longer controlling, just still. "We will reissue the document immediately," she added, her tone returning to professionalism but carrying a different weight, one shaped by what had already been said, and Marcus's eyes moved briefly to the pieces on the counter before returning to her, and there was a pause, small but noticeable, as if he was deciding whether that solution addressed what mattered, and when he spoke, his voice remained calm, unchanged, but the words carried something deeper, something that reached beyond the paper. "It was never about the check," he said, and the simplicity of the statement shifted the focus once again, pulling it away from the transaction and placing it somewhere more difficult to measure, and Linda felt it immediately, the way the words redirected the entire moment, the way they exposed what had been underlying everything from the beginning. And she did not respond right away, because there was nothing procedural that could answer that, nothing in her training that provided a script for what came next, and the man beside her looked at Marcus again, his expression thoughtful now, not just respectful but understanding, as if he recognized the significance of what had just been said, and the quiet stretched once more, not tense, not uncertain, but reflective, and Marcus's gaze moved briefly across the room, taking in the people who had watched, the space that had shifted, the atmosphere that had changed, and then back to the counter, where the pieces of paper still remained, a physical reminder of something intangible, and he reached forward slowly, not to gather them, not to fix them, but simply to move one piece slightly, aligning it with the others in a gesture that felt less like repair and more like acknowledgement. And then he withdrew his hand, leaving them as they were, because some things were not meant to be put back together, not in the same way, and the room understood that, even if no one said it out loud, as the moment settled into something quieter, something lasting, something that would remain long after the transaction itself was completed. The words lingered in the air longer than anything else that had been said, not because they were louder or sharper, but because they reached into something deeper that could not be corrected with procedure or replaced with a new document. And for a moment Linda did not move, her eyes still on Marcus, her posture no longer defensive but uncertain in a way that felt unfamiliar, as if the ground beneath her understanding had shifted and had not yet settled, and she glanced down again at the pieces of the check, then back up, The motion slower now, more deliberate, as if she were seeing both the object and the moment differently than before, and the man beside her remained quiet, allowing the silence to do its work, allowing the realization to form without interruption, and Marcus stood steady, his presence unchanged, not pressing the moment forward, not retreating from it, simply holding space for it to become what it needed to be. And Linda drew in a breath, deeper this time, her shoulders lowering slightly as something in her posture softened, not in weakness but in acceptance. And when she spoke again, her voice carried a different tone, less constructed, more real. "You are right," she said, the words simple but weighted. It should never have come to this, and there was no defense in them. No attempt to shift responsibility, just a clear acknowledgement that extended beyond the action to the assumption behind it. And Marcus listened, his expression calm, his gaze steady, and he nodded once, not in approval, not in absolution, but in recognition that she had stepped into the truth of the moment. And Linda's hands rested flat on the counter, no longer moving, no longer trying to manage the situation, just present. And she continued, slower now, choosing each word with care. "I let what I thought I saw define what I believed was true." And the admission settled into the room with a quiet finality, and behind them the customers remained still, not out of curiosity anymore, but out of respect for what was unfolding. And Emily stood with her hands lightly clasped, her eyes moving between them, witnessing something she had not been trained to process but would not forget. And the man beside Linda inclined his head slightly, his gaze thoughtful, as if acknowledging not just the words but the shift they represented. And Marcus's eyes softened just a fraction, not with emotion displayed, but with something internal, something that recognized the difference between an apology spoken out of obligation and one that came from understanding. And he exhaled slowly, the breath steady, and his voice, when it came, remained calm, measured, but carried a quiet weight that settled into every corner of the space. "Respect does not come from numbers," he said, each word deliberate. "And it does not wait for proof." And the statement moved through the room with a clarity that needed no explanation, reframing everything that had happened, placing it in a context that extended far beyond the transaction itself. And Linda lowered her gaze briefly, absorbing the meaning, her expression shifting as the realization deepened, not just about Marcus, but about every similar moment she might have overlooked before, every quiet assumption she had never questioned. And when she looked up again, there was no trace of the earlier dismissal, only a recognition that carried both weight and responsibility. And she nodded slowly, as if committing the lesson to something more permanent than memory. And the man beside her spoke again, his tone calm, composed. "We will ensure this is addressed internally," he said, not as a dismissal of the moment, but as an extension of it, a recognition that what had happened was not isolated. And Marcus acknowledged him with a small nod, his attention returning briefly to the counter, to the pieces of paper that still remained. And he reached out once more, this time gathering them gently, not to repair them but to remove them, clearing the space in front of him with a quiet finality. And he placed them to the side, out of the center, as if marking the end of that part of the moment. And then he looked back at Linda, his expression steady, not hardened, not softened, simply clear. And there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to prove, only the understanding that had taken shape between them. And the room seemed to breathe again, not with tension but with release, as the weight of what had happened settled into something quieter, something lasting, something that would remain long after the check itself was replaced. The moment did not end with a statement. It softened into something quieter, something that did not need to be spoken to be understood. And Marcus stepped back from the counter with the same calm presence he had carried from the beginning, his hand moving to close the leather wallet before slipping it back into his jacket, the motion simple, unhurried, as if nothing about him had changed even though everything around him had. And the light from the tall glass windows shifted slightly as a cloud passed outside, casting a softer glow across the marble floor. And for a brief second the reflection of the room seemed less sharp, less rigid, like the edges of something had been smoothed out. And Linda watched him, not with the authority she had held before, but with a quiet awareness that lingered in her posture, her shoulders no longer squared for control, but settled in a way that suggested something internal had shifted, something that would not simply return to its previous form once he walked away. And the man beside her stepped back slightly, giving space without needing to direct it. His role in the moment complete, not because the transaction had been resolved, but because the truth had been seen. And Marcus turned toward the exit, his steps steady, each one echoing softly against the polished floor, and the room did not resume immediately. No one rushed forward. No one spoke over the silence, because something about the moment had asked for stillness, had earned it. And as he moved past the line of customers, a few of them shifted subtly, not stepping aside dramatically, just enough to acknowledge his presence in a way they had not before, their eyes no longer filled with quiet judgment, but with something more reflective, something that lingered after recognition replaces assumption. And Marcus did not react to it, did not slow, did not change his pace, because the acknowledgement was not what he had come for. And the doors ahead opened with a soft mechanical sound as he approached, the outside light brighter now, stretching into the lobby and meeting him halfway. And for a moment he paused, not to look back, not to hold on to the moment, but simply to take in a breath that felt different from the one he had carried inside. Lighter, not because something had been won, but because something had been clarified. And behind him Linda remained where she was, her gaze following him until he reached the threshold. And then it shifted, slowly, back to the counter, to the space where the pieces of paper had been, now cleared, but not forgotten, and she rested her hands there again, not to steady herself this time, but to feel the surface that had witnessed everything. The same counter she had stood behind countless times before, now holding a different meaning, and Emily glanced at her, uncertain for a moment before returning her attention to the screen. The routine beginning to resume, but not fully reclaiming its place. And the man who had spoken earlier gave Linda a brief look, not critical, not dismissive, but knowing. Before turning away, his steps measured as he moved back toward the office, leaving her with the quiet aftermath of what had happened. And Linda inhaled slowly, her eyes lowering for a second before lifting again, her reflection faintly visible in the polished surface in front of her. And in that reflection there was no audience, no expectation, just the simple presence of someone who had seen something clearly for the first time. And outside the doors Marcus stepped into the sunlight, the brightness settling over him as the doors closed softly behind him, sealing the moment inside while allowing its meaning to move forward with him. And the street beyond carried its own rhythm, cars passing, distant voices blending into a steady hum, life continuing without pause. And he walked into it without looking back, his figure steady against the light, not defined by what had happened inside, but unchanged by it in the way that mattered most. And inside the bank the quiet eventually gave way to movement again, to voices, to the return of routine. But beneath it something remained, something that could not be undone or unseen, something that would linger in the way decisions were made, in the pause before judgment, in the memory of a moment where assumption had met truth and could not hold its ground. And Linda stood there a second longer before turning to her work, her movements slower, more deliberate, not because she had been told to change, but because she now understood why she should. And the space between what people appeared to be and who they truly were felt wider than it had before. And far more important, as the light from the windows continued to shift across the floor, marking time in quiet, steady motion. Long after the moment itself had passed.